Hello there. Thank you very much for joining us on this, our first Thursday webinar. And I got through saying that. Today we're going to be talking about newts. I'm Stephanie Ray, and my co-presenter here, Tim Hounsome, are both directors at RSK Biocensus, and we'll be taking you through the presentation this morning. So first of all, we've just got a few housekeeping notes. Your microphones will be all automatically muted at the moment. You can ask questions at any point through the webinar by using the questions box on your dashboard there. You can write the questions in. We'll have a question and answer session at the end, and we'll try to answer as many of them as we can. But if we don't have time for all of the questions, then we will try and get back to you directly afterwards if we can. I might ask you a question during the presentation, and you can use the putting your hand up option on your dashboard to answer yes or no to that. And then finally, shortly after we finish the session today, we'll send you out a quick feedback questionnaire. It is only short, it'll take you a few minutes to fill out, but if you could just give us some feedback, that'd be really grateful, and then we can make sure we give you more of what you actually want on these sessions. So Tim and I are going to turn off our webcams now, and we'll press on with the presentation. So I'll tell you first about who we are, RSK Biocensus. We're an ecological consultancy with a couple of subsidiaries, RSK Rewilding and Nature Positive. And we're quite a big team now, 70 permanent staff and about 750, 800 of our specialist sub-consultants scattered around the country, as you can see on the map there. And that tends to mean that if you live on the UK mainland, you're probably not more than 25 miles from an RSK Biocensus ecologist. So not as close as you are to a rat, but there's certainly quite a few of us. And we do a lot more than just newts, and you'll hear about that over the coming first Thursdays, but that's the topic that we want to talk about today. So why newts and why now? Normally you'll find ecologists banging on about newts in February when they're trying to get you to book your surveys in time. But I'm sure you've all heard Boris being deliberately provocative recently, when he accused the humble great crested newt of being a drag on development, and us ecologists with our newt counting ways as part of the problem. And by the way, this is meant to be Boris Johnson and not, as the artist indicated to me, Jimmy Tarbuck in a Michael Fabricant wig. So before we go any further then, I think I'll ask your opinions from various angles, and I notice in the audience we've got developers and we've got other advisors to developers. So can you tell me, have you worked on a project where you think that newts have actually been a significant cause of delay to the project being completed? And if you could just raise your hands using your dashboard and let me know, I shall be able to tell you how many people think there's been a significant delay. Numbers are still changing, so I will give it a minute to let people all vote. Okay, so that's stabilising around 20%. All right, oh, it's going down again. 15%. A few no's are coming in now. Okay, so about 20% of you then feel that you've had some sort of a delay relating to newts, and it's perfectly feasible that you have had a delay relating to newts. But I think probably newts have been scapegoated a little bit in Boris's soundbites recently, and hopefully we can debunk a few myths about their ability to derail a project before the government tinkers with the planning system any further, as we've seen from the consultation launched this morning. So hopefully we'll learn a little bit more about newts and how to make sure that they don't get in your way, and let your future projects sail through the wonderfully simplified planning system. So first of all, let's start with a little bit of basic biology and tell you about great crested newts. So it's our biggest newt in this country. They're up to sort of 15, 16 centimetres long, and they look like this. They're sort of dark browny black on the top with a bright orange belly with black spots all over it. And these sort of warty little nodules along the sides of the body that can have a sort of a white dots on them, as you can see. Now the males have this crest that you can see here in the breeding season and have a white flash along the tail, and the females have an orangey yellow flash along the tail. So they're quite easy to distinguish from other species of newts that we have in the UK. They're native to the UK. They've been here for 40 million years or so. In comparison, humans have been here for about 40,000 years or so. So, hey, whose ponds are they anyway? And they're amphibians. So it's important that we recognise that they spend part of their time in water where they breed and part of their time on land. And they're important within the ecosystem for doing that. So they're part of what cycles nutrients between freshwater and terrestrial habitats. They eat small invertebrates and so on. They eat things like mosquito larvae, so they've got a role in pest control, and they provide food for fish, for birds, for even foxes and badgers. So that's where they sit. That's their role in the ecosystem, if you like. They prefer bigger ponds, not huge lakes, but bigger ponds with marginal vegetation and preferably without fish or ducks that eat them. They're active at night. They eat invertebrates and tadpoles, and in the spring, the adults come into the ponds to breed. The female lays her eggs on the vegetation, so she carefully folds leaves and puts individual eggs into little folds of vegetation around the edge of the pond. The larvae hatch 2 or 4 weeks later, and they've got sort of obvious feathery gills, external gills. They grow over a couple of months. They start to grow front legs and then back legs. And then in the summer, the adults leave the ponds mostly. And in late summer, once they've absorbed their gills, so do the baby newts, which are called eggs. And then in the autumn and winter, they spend time on land. But a proportion of them, and this is quite important, a proportion of them may stay in the pond, in or around the pond at all times of year. So that's your basic newt natural history lecture. I'm not really going into any more details of the wonder of newts than that, but those are just the sort of things that are actually underpin what we do and why we have to do them at certain times of year. So looking then at their conservation status, as I've said, they're native to the UK, but their distribution is quite patchy throughout the UK. They're pretty widespread throughout most of England and Wales. They start to peter out as you get to the southwest, so they're not so common at all in Devon and Cornwall. They're pretty much absent from mid Wales and appear again as you get to West Wales. They're not really there in Scotland. They don't exist in Ireland at all. And from parts of Europe, they've also been lost as well. So over the last 50 years, populations are thought to have declined quite dramatically right across their range in Europe. And our population in the UK is thought to be around 400,000 animals in about 18,000 breeding sites. And I know that sounds like quite a lot, but it's an order of magnitude smaller than a lot of protected species. And actually, when you're getting down to animals of this sort of scale, you do expect to have more than that. So I think we have this sort of perception with sometimes that you encounter newts on your development site and your approach is, well, how can they be a rare species? How can I be having to go to all this trouble to deal with them when I'm tripping over them on my development site? And the answer to that is really that, well, it may seem like there's a lot of great crested newts occasionally in the pockets where we find them, but we as a country have the significant proportion of the world's great crested newt population. And so that's what the legislation is about. That's what our conservation priorities are around, are protecting, to ensure that this species survives globally. So because of that conservation status, newts are legally protected. And so they're protected under European legislation, the habitats regulations, but also under the Wildlife and Countryside Act. So it isn't something that was imposed on us by Europe. It isn't something that will go away when we leave the European Union in December. And the requirements of both of those laws say that you'll be breaking the law if you capture or kill them, if you deliberately disturb them or injure them, if you destroy their breeding sites, their resting places, or where they're taking shelter when they're on dry land. You can't own or sell or handle bits of newt or live or dead newts or even newt eggs. So it's a fairly comprehensive package there of protection measures. And in order to avoid that, that's why we're doing these newts. That's why we're doing these newt surveys. That's why we're being so concerned about them, encountering them on development sites. So traditionally, we've surveyed them. You'll all have seen charts like this. Every ecologist will have one, a list of the seasonal constraints of different kinds of surveys. And if you look in the sort of list of animal surveys at the bottom there, you've got badger surveys. You can do those at any time of year. It's not a problem at all. And then you come down to great crested newts here, and you've got this tiny little window where it's possible to do great crested newt surveys from mid-March to mid-June. And this, I think, is where the delay issue comes from. This concept that we can only survey them for a very short window in the year, so we survey for them then, and that's because they're much easier to survey for when they're in their ponds. And once we know that, once we've dealt with them, they're in their ponds and we know we've got them, if we then have to do some mitigation, I might have to trap them out and move them, we're waiting again for another year till they're in the ponds again to be sure that we can remove them all. And I think this is where the issue of delays has come from. So we've got two tight seasonal constraints. Now, most of our survey methods rely on great crested newts being in the ponds. But here are all of the survey methods that we have available to us. We start off with a habitat suitability index, and that is just a simple assessment of the pond itself and whether it's suitable to support great crested newts. And we do that by going out in the daytime and looking at the pond and seeing how deep it is, how big it is, what sort of marginal vegetation it's got, whether it's got overhanging vegetation that shades it, how well connected it is to other features and so on. And we work out from these an index of how likely it is to be suitable for great crested newts. And that's quite important. You can get quite a long way with that habitat suitability index, and possibly we don't use that enough as a profession in development to actually plan ahead and work out where we've got issues. Because what people tend to do is launch straight into the detailed surveys. Now, to actually assess great crested newt populations, you need a combination of 3 survey methods: torching surveys, bottle trapping, and egg searching. So torching surveys are exactly what it says on the tin. You go out with a bright million candle power torch at night and you watch for the newts in the water column. You go searching the vegetation around the edge of the pond, looking for great crested newt eggs, which are folded in a very distinctive way into the vegetation, and you can open up those little folds carefully and identify one great crested newt egg from other species. And then we've got bottle trapping, which is simply a plastic 1.5 litre water bottle with the top cut off and inverted into the bottle as a funnel, and you stick those, like you can see there, on canes into the water body. Now, you can only do these surveys in that very narrow window of March to June, and you would typically go out 4 times. If you didn't find any newts within 4 visits, you would assume that they were absent. And if you found newts within those, you do a second 2 visits. You do 6 visits in total to assess the population size. So those are the traditional means of surveying for newts. I will briefly mention conservation dogs. This is Rocky, the spaniel. He's owned by an organisation called Wagtail, who've been out to advise us on searching for great crested newts with dogs. They're highly trained sniffer dogs. They can be trained to look for bats or dormice or various species, but Rocky is trained to identify great crested newts, and he can distinguish them from other species of newts, and that can be really helpful and speed up your survey of just confirming whether newts are present on a site. But if you are tempted to get a conservation dog out on one of your projects, if you have staff like mine, I would urge you to get the dog out towards the end of the working day, because frankly, after they've all been petting the dog in the morning, you won't get any sense out of anybody for the rest of the day. So moving on to other survey methods, we now have an approach using environmental DNA. So environmental DNA is the DNA that's associated with an organism that's just deposited into its environment. So brushed off skin cells, feces, gametes, and so on. And that doesn't exist for long. It's not detectable for long in the environment, and this just demonstrates, how much DNA you could extract and identify from different media like snow and soil. And it shows you that the big green bar there is water. Water is actually quite good at keeping DNA available to be sampled for a little while. It's quite effective as a means. It's easier to sample DNA from water than it is from soil or leaf litter. And so that is now how we do a lot of surveys for great crested newts. We detect great crested newt DNA in the water columns itself. So we don't have to go out 6 times at night to say that they're there. So we simply take some water samples, those are vortex down, and the DNA is extracted. That's run through a magic box called a PCR, and you're looking for an identified section of newt DNA in the sample, and you multiply that up many times, and then you will see this sort of S-shaped curve appear if the great crested newt DNA is present. I should say this is thanks to our colleagues at ADAS who have an eDNA lab, and I'll give them a shameless plug and say that they are the only lab in the UK that has correctly identified all samples in every QA proficiency test for newt DNA. So it is possible to do it really very accurately indeed from just forensic amounts of DNA in the water column. Now, that's hugely important to us. And what I will say is the fact that DNA doesn't hang around in the environment for too long is both a blessing and a curse, because it means that if you get a positive sample, then newts were there within the last 2 or 3 weeks. It wasn't a newt popped by once 10 years ago. However, that does mean that if your newts are only using the pond seasonally and then going away from it, it doesn't really extend your survey season that much. But as hopefully you'll recall, I did say earlier that a proportion of newts doesn't always leave the pond at the end of the summer. The proportion of a population, certainly in bigger populations, you might find a measurable proportion of the newts are actually overwintering in the bottom of the pond or in the wet mud around the edge of the pond. So whilst Natural England wouldn't accept an eDNA survey result out of season that said you didn't have newts as definitive, and you might have to test again in the right time of year, if you got a positive result out of season, you would at least know what you were dealing with and be able to move on no matter what the time of year. So sometimes big ponds, likely big populations, it may well be worth investing in some of those surveys out of season to just move your program forward. Now, once we assume that we have got great crested newts, we need to then look at how we're going to mitigate for that effect on site, for that fact on site. And that will normally mean if ponds are going to be affected, that we have to create new ponds and we have to translocate the newts from their old site over to their new site. Now, traditionally, this work has always proceeded under a license issued by Natural England. So the licensee can then move newts to their new ponds and pick them up, as in this picture here, from terrestrial habitat around, out of the footprint of the works and into a safe new habitat. Now, this is something that can result in some long lead-in times because you have to get new ponds established before newts can move into them. And so my sort of top tip here for avoiding delays would be, well, you don't need planning permission to build a pond, do you? And building a new pond is never going to be a bad thing. So it may well be worthwhile doing some of these measures in advance, even before you've got consent, maybe even in parallel with finding out whether you've got great crested newts at all, because building a pond is cheap. Building a pond is a nice conservation action to do, and you may well find that even if you don't need it to translocate great crested newts into, it can help contribute to your biodiversity net gain, which is mandated in the forthcoming Environment Act. So think about what you can do early, and then make sure that when you're trapping, you have a method that's appropriate to the scale of your site. I think another of the issues around great crested newts and why people can get quite worked up about them is that sometimes people have had bad advice, or people have had a sort of a tick box approach perhaps, where they choose the same approach and mitigation to every site. And sometimes where population numbers are quite small or risks are quite low, that's not necessarily the best thing to do. And I think it's having the confidence to take each site on its merits and say what you do or don't need to do on that site. There's no reason to put miles and miles of plastic fencing in the countryside to try and catch 3 newts. Remember Rocky the conservation dog? You'd be far better getting him in to identify those 3 newts in the part of your site that they're in and move them safely, rather than needlessly using single-use plastic. So again, I think this is because traditionally some of these protected species mitigations were done quite badly, that guidelines have been developed, but guidelines are only guidelines. They're there to help people and not there to be stuck to rigidly. You need to find the right solution for your site and then agree that with the regulator. So the new approach then that's come along in recent years is district level licensing. So rather than the individual project having a mitigation license for its site, the opportunity exists to contribute to a district level scheme. Now, this came about because of Natural England's new licensing policies, which came into force about 4 years ago now, I think. And they were around having greater flexibility when excluding and relocating European protected species from development sites, having more flexibility in where you would put the new habitats for those newts, so not necessarily right next door and within your development site, allowing protected species to have access to temporary habitats that would be developed at a later stage, so sort of taking a phased approach within your development. And then the level of survey that you needed could be tailored where the impacts of development can be confidently predicted. So for example, if you know that you have got a large population of great crested newts, do we really need to go out 6 times to prove that if we know that straight away? So what Natural England came up with was what they call a district level licensing scheme. And that's an alternative approach to where you have a district-wide survey of great crested newts and you assess that against the local plan and to where impacts on newts are likely to come from over the local plan period. They then map the areas of high and low risk to the conservation status of newts and where they're most likely to pose an issue for development. And then Natural England helps the local planning authority to understand where development should be avoided, or if development can't be avoided, where very high levels of mitigation will be needed to protect those great crested newts, and where the opportunities are for providing compensatory habitat. Where you're in a high risk area, you'll have to do individual mitigation for your site. When you're in a low or medium risk area, then you'll be allowed to just contribute to the district level licensing scheme, and then they will deliver your compensation for you based on a planned strategic approach of where they're going to create ponds across that district to make sure that newts are protected and things are and habitats are joined up for newts. So this all sounds very good. And if you join into that scheme, then you don't have to do surveys on your site and you don't have to do mitigation on your site. Now, that can certainly help program. It can be more or less expensive. Frankly, it just depends. In some situations, if you had very low risk of newts, actually, it might well be cheaper to just deal with it yourself on a site basis. In a medium newt population, it may well be less expensive, but you do get certainty of program and you do get certainty that you'll be allowed to go ahead as planned. The issue though is that this is effectively a license to kill a European protected species. So you would be killing newts lawfully, but at risk of bad press for your development, and that might be something that you want to avoid, and that may well explain why there's been not perhaps as great a take-up of the district level licensing scheme as we might have expected. So I mentioned briefly earlier that biodiversity net gain will become mandatory for developments under the Town and Country Planning Act in England over the next 2 years. We expect the bill to come into force early next year, and there's a 2-year implementation period. And that will mean that all developments will need to calculate the biodiversity value of their site before development, and then after development to ensure that they deliver at least a 10% net gain. Now, when you have to deliver that net gain, is it sensible to try to deliver it on site, or is it where you're paying development rates, development costs for land, or to develop it off-site? Now, you're going to want to do, I'm not saying don't do anything on site at all, because there are other reasons to do good things on site, but I'm saying that when you get to the level that you have to offset, rather than squeezing it in and compromising some of the other features of your development and doing it at a rate that's more expensive, perhaps that's the time to consider doing things off-site. So given that you'll have to deliver some off-site works to give your 10% net gain, look at the options to combine your Great Crested Newt mitigation and your other mitigation or offsetting requirements, and to do things that will benefit the district at a much greater level. So contributing to a local wildlife site, or contributing to a nature recovery network, or contributing to a strategic rewilding site that's there to allow natural ecosystems to recover, might be better ways of doing it, might result in better PR, and indeed might allow you to get on and deliver those works quicker, because you can proceed faster off-site than you can on-site. So finally then, how to build back bigger and better and greener and wilder? So I suppose, how do we avoid newt counting delays in the first place? It's always around planning. If you have a 12-month lead-in time to planning, then everything's going to be fine. You can give me a 12-month lead-in time starting at any time of year, and there will not be a delay. But we don't always get a 12-month lead-in time, and if it's not possible, do consider district level licensing if it's available in that local authority. I think there's about 60 district level licensing schemes at the moment. No, actually probably closer to 70 now out of the 300 local planning authorities in England. So it's increasing, it's becoming increasingly available. And obviously it's focused on the areas where there are great crested newts. So, some of the local authorities it won't be relevant to so much. So do look at that and see if it's available, and see whether it might be the best for your scheme. Start from a position of knowledge. So do an early risk assessment. That could just be desk-based. It could just be looking at the great crested newt distribution. If you're working in Cornwall, you're less likely to have a problem than if you're working in Cheshire. Or if you're in a district licensing region, then you might have much richer information. You might know if you're in a high, low or medium risk zone. If you know you're likely to have newts, you can plan around it. You could make more use of the HSI, going and looking out the ponds and just getting a feeling, doing some out of season eDNA tests and get a feeling for what the level of your risk and the level of your mitigation is likely to be. And that can really help, because if you're more aware of it, then it's less likely to be the thing that slows you down. And there will be other things that you'll be arguing your listed building consent or negotiating your sale, but it won't be great crested newts. Make use of the DLL where it's available. It gives you cost and time certainty, but do remember that PR risk, depending on what sort of local scrutiny there is of your site. When you do need to do mitigation and compensation for great crested newts, make it count by doing it early. You don't need planning permission to build a pond, but make it proportionate. Be realistic about what are the actual levels of risks to the conservation of newts on your site, and do it accordingly. Don't just go by the book and put up miles and miles of plastic fencing and thousands of bottle traps. be realistic. Think about the ways that you can target it, how you can use new techniques like conservation dogs to try and smooth that process and make it work more effectively. And remember that we need green infrastructure. People need green infrastructure. So we want your development to be green, but nature needs wild places. Nature needs open space to do its stuff. And that's why if you can get your Great Crested Newt mitigation to contribute to some more significant structural rewilding scheme, then you will be doing your bit to build back better and actually delivering better places. So I think that's all that I have to say at the moment, and I think we've got time to take some questions. I'll put my webcam back on so you can see me, and I think Tim will probably be able to see if we've got any questions. Thanks.
Hello.
Tim.
Thanks very much, Steph. Yes, we've got a couple of questions here. The first one is from Christine, who is a principal planner. Would creating a pond not constitute groundworks engineering operation that requires planning permission?
Not always, no. It depends where you're building it and what you're building it for. If your pond was part of your scheme, that it was being designed as part of a, if you're designing a lovely pond on a village green or something, then yeah, arguably it's part of your scheme. If you've negotiated with a local farmer to build a pond in the corner of one of his fields, then no. So look at the opportunities where you can get your mitigation in early without having to seek consent for it.
Okay, another one we got here is, does mitigating for Great Crested Newts add to the value for your biodiversity net gain?
Well, you can't double count it. So if you have to deal with all of your species mitigation first. So if it's something that you had to do anyway by law to mitigate your Great Crested Newt issues, then you wouldn't be able to count that as well into your biodiversity net gain package. So you do have to be careful about double counting, but there are ways to build those in together. So perhaps most mitigation packages, certainly the district level licensing mitigation packages, are around pond creation, but putting those ponds within a landscape that's enhancing your biodiversity net gain would be a way that would, you could subtly increase your biodiversity net gain points if you like, but you couldn't actually double count it.
Okay, another one, is district licensing being done in Wales and Scotland?
A simple answer to that one, no, not at the moment. Environment is a devolved competence, and the Welsh and Scottish governments take a different view on a lot of aspects of environmental protection, and this is one of them. At the moment, neither of them have any plans to introduce it.
Okay, we got another question from Robert, who's from Gladman. At outline stage, how does creating a pond affect the net gain assessment? Isn't the baseline assessment done at the point of application, so you will lose out on the net gain?
Well, potentially if you did it on site, yes. But if you do it off site on neighbouring land, then no. So yeah, if you build it too early on your own site, yeah.
Okay. Well, looking down the list here now. So we've experienced significant delays from Natural England. Do you think the government will give more resource to Natural England in the future?
I really hope so. I really hope so. Natural England has been starved of investment for a number of years now. But given the prominence that the government has placed on the 25-year environment plan, and given the reforms that they want to pull through the Environment Act, then I would imagine that it will be necessary for Natural England to have more resources, and also for local planning authorities. It's an acknowledged gap that most local planning authorities don't employ ecologists anymore, which makes it really difficult. If you come with a scheme and you say we're going to do these clever, innovative things, if they haven't got an ecologist who can engage with that on an intellectual level and go, oh yeah, that's going to work, but they've just got a planner who has to go by, but the guidelines say this because he's not in a position to negotiate anything different, then you're not going to be able to do anything new and innovative. So it's really important, I think, that both of those aspects are resource better.
Okay, probably a fairly quick one, I guess. How do you find out which local authority are carrying out the using the district licensing system?
Okay, it's really simple. You can go onto the gov.uk website under district level licensing, and you can just enter the postcode of your development, and it'll tell you if there's a scheme locally.
Excellent. Okay, just looking. We have another question from Sarah, who's from Wessex Water. Are there any particular district licensing examples that you know of to be working very well? Good case studies to consider.
Yeah, there are several people who've used it who found it really effective. I mean, my views on district level licensing at the start were quite cynical. I will be honest. When it was trialled in Woking, and I think probably only about 3 ponds were built before it was declared a great success and rolled out across the country. So I was a little bit cynical of it, but actually the more I've seen, and some of the schemes that are going on in the Midlands and the Northwest are actually, they're delivering about an 8-to-1 ratio of ponds, new ponds for ponds lost, which is great. And I have heard several developers say that it saved them time and money. So it's definitely worth investigating for your site.
Okay, here's a bit of an open-ended one. How do you think the current government's rhetoric on build, build, build will affect the protection of great crested newts and other protected species?
Wow.
How long have you got?
How long have we got? Yeah. It's really difficult, isn't it? We were promised repeatedly at the time that the government agreed a withdrawal agreement that there wouldn't be any rowing back of environmental protection or watering down of the existing environmental protection, and that we'd even accept case law from Europe that came up to the point that we leave in December. So on the one hand, we've been told that. On the other hand, about a week ago, George Eustace gave a speech from which he said, there's no point leaving the EU if we keep everything the same. So, you know, hearing that coming from the Secretary of State for the Environment doesn't fill me with huge hope. Now, when I say that I think we can't afford to row back on environmental protection, it's not that I'm anti-building. You know, it's just that I'm pro-environment. Yes, we can build, and we can build sustainably. I think what we need to do is to get the environmental protection bit right and make it clear so that everybody knows where they stand. And of course, development is a tiny proportion of the land area. Most environmental protection will be achieved by sorting out agricultural land management and making sure that we get the new approach to farming subsidies and how we pay farmers for delivering public goods.
Okay, thank you. I think we're pretty much out of questions unless somebody's going to throw one in at the last minute, which we can deal with. But I suppose it just remains for me to say thank you to Steph for a very interesting talk, and also thank you for everybody for attending today. If you've got any other questions that pop into your mind after this, after we finish, then you can email us on the contact details you've seen on that slide, and we'll hopefully get back to you on those. The next presentation is next first Thursday Club presentation is going to be on the 3rd of September, and that's going to be on badgers and will be delivered by our very own Professor Delahaye. So make sure you sign up for that. I think also we're going to send a feedback form after this, so we would be it would be great if you could take a few minutes to fill that in so that we can sort of refine what we're doing and that sort of thing for the next couple of presentations. But apart from that, I think we'll end there, and thank you again for your attendance.
Thanks very much.